Hey guys, Aravind Yuvraj here and I'm your friendly neighborhood content creator. In the last video, we learned about exposure and one of the three major factors that affects it, the ISO. If you haven't watched that video yet, I would suggest that you go watch it here because this video is a follow-up, and in this video, we are going to talk about aperture. So let's hop in. Now let us do an exercise. Lift your forefinger and keep it right in front of your face and focus your vision on it. As you could see, the background is being extremely blurred. Now, move your forefinger far away from your face and you could see that the background is coming to focus. So this is what we are going to learn about aperture. Technically, aperture is the diameter of the opening of the blades which is present inside the lens that allows a certain amount of light to pass through the lens and to hit on the sensor. That took a lot of time to get it right. Aperture is denoted by the term f-stop, and f-stop is derived by dividing the focal length of the lens over the diameter of the opening of the aperture blades inside the lens. The lower the aperture, the higher the f-stop, and vice versa. Mostly f-stop ranges from as low as 1.2 to as high as 22. I know it's kind of tricky, so let me explain it visually. So as you can see, I've set up a background element behind me which is like roughly 2 feet away, and my f-stop is at f1.4. If the f-stop is 1.4, it can be denoted by f over 1.4. That's a higher aperture with shallow depth of field and more exposure as more light is let in. So what is depth of field? Depth of field technically means the distance between the subject and the background, both of which are in focus. If both the subject and the background are in focus, it's higher depth of field. If only the subject is in focus and the background is in out of focus, it's shallow depth of field. Now let us shift to f-stop 16, which is the lowest aperture value in this camera for now, that has more depth of field and allows less amount of light to hit on the sensor, meaning less exposure. This is not at all advisable. The ISO value is set to 16,000 to compensate the exposure. As you could see now, the background element which I added is in more focus. Now if we zoom into this part of the video and compare it with the video which was shot on f1.4, you could see that the camera behind me, which is the background element, is in more focus in f16 compared to that of f1.4. Now let me switch back to normal. Do you find this to be tricky even now? Just remember this equation. Low aperture is equals to higher f-stop equals to more depth of field equals to low exposure. Similarly, higher aperture is equals to smaller f-stop equals to shallow depth of field equals to high exposure. The summary. In this video, we learned about aperture, which is responsible for the amount of light that is allowed into the camera, which affects the depth of field and the exposure of the image. If we are in a low light situation right now, taking the concept that we learned from the last video, we can avoid increasing the ISO. Rather, we can increase the aperture value, which means we should have the lowest f-stop number as possible. Even after doing this, does your image look underexposed? This is where shutter speed comes into the picture, and we are going to learn about it in the next video. So if you have any doubts regarding this video, feel free to use the comment section. I'll reply as soon as possible. Until then, stay tuned and keep creating.